We need to start thinking of Irish American writing and writers as being just as diverse as Ireland and America. And I suppose we need to remember that that sort of diversity is not a new phenomenon either.
Welcome to Ireland and the Making of America, a podcast exploring how Ireland and the Irish helped shape the United States, politically, culturally, socially, and sometimes in ways that people rarely think about. I'm Liam Kennedy, Director of the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. In this episode, we're joined by Mary Burke, who's Professor of English at University of Connecticut in the US. Mary has expertise in Irish and Irish American literatures and is the author of the book Race, Politics and Irish America, A Gothic History, published by Oxford University Press. Mary's going to help us explore the Irish literary experience in America, with particular attention to how the Irish dealt with matters of race and class from the mid-18th century to the mid-20th. Mary, welcome to the podcast.
Liam, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, for close to 250 years, the Irish have been a strong, if often overlooked, presence in American writing. So today, we're going to cover writing by and about the Irish of all stripes in America over the past 250 years, and the contribution of that body of writing to the making of ideas of race and assimilation across the time span of the American Republic. Now, Mary, in our first episodes, we discussed the settlement and the impact of Irish and Ulster-Scot immigrants in the 18th and 19th centuries. We got a sense of some of the differences of how they settled, of what they did, of what impact they had. But you're going to start us off by getting us to think about, well, how were they represented? How did they become what you call a concern in American writing already by the late 18th century? And I think you see the origins of this concern in the fact that the Ulster Irish initially constituted a somewhat problematic population segment in the colonies. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, what's written about a lot is Benjamin Franklin, right? What he said. He kind of implied an initial flawed whiteness, really, a flawed white capacity for brutality, when he called the Scots-Irish perpetrators of a really horrific massacre of Native Americans in Pennsylvania in 1763. This phrase he used in all caps was, in his writing, was Christian white savages. So, there was a perception that the Ulster Irish were bringing from their disordered motherland violence to the Pennsylvania frontier. And that actually makes its way into one of America's earliest novels, which is a Gothic narrative. It's published in 1799 by...
Hold on, Mary. You can't get away with saying a Gothic novel. You're going to have to tell us now what you mean by Gothic in this context.
Sure. Yes. So what I wanted to say there too is that he's a Pennsylvania author. So this Gothic writer. So Gothic, in a nutshell, I suppose, it's fiction, can be film as well. But in my case, I'm talking about fiction. It's fiction with a grotesque, sinister, claustrophobic atmosphere. It's always, a narrative in which the unresolved past, right? The undead past, the unquiet dead, they're always going to come back, right? It emerged in the 18th century kind of in response to political sort of context there. And the very first American Gothic, the one I want to talk about, is by Charles Braxton Brown. It's called Edgar Huntley. And it centers on a seemingly dangerous Scots-Irish immigrant servant.
Right. So we're dealing with the undead. I like what you said there. It seems like another take on the idea that you can't keep the Irish down. Although the Ulster Scots, as we might have called them then, were to throw the lot in with the British in the 19th century in terms of loyalty and identity, that was hardly apparent in the radical 1790s, of course, as suggested by the increasing anxiety regarding an immigrant of that background in the early American novels. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so in this particular, 1799 novel, the reputation for violence of the frontier Scots-Irish, it's present. Of course, this violence had provoked anxiety, in America before, as Franklin's words suggest. I think to sort of pull it up from Franklin's era then to the more immediate context, the later involvement of the radicalized Irish of all stripes in the 1798 uprising against British rule in Ireland, this sent many political refugees to America in its wake. So that's the more immediate context. And of course, this novel is published just 1 year after that revolt in Ireland. Shall I just give you a sense of the, quick reprise of the action, right?
I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, because I don't assume people have read this. It's a blockbuster. So Edgar Huntley, it tells of murder and frontier violence in rural Pennsylvania in the 1780s. The title character, he relates the consequences of his chance encounter with a local servant named Clitheroe. So this guy's very mysterious. He's an immigrant, modest origin. And rumor has it that he's had this violent history in Dublin, and this has followed him to the so-called New World. So it seems that in Ireland, he had killed his wealthy Anglo-Irish benefactress, a woman called Mrs. Lorimer, and her brother. And this violence in him kind of erupts again, or threatens to erupt when he is in Pennsylvania.
So that 1798 uprising is obviously a very significant historical and political context. What's the more immediate political context in the United States?
Right. So it was written obviously in the, the immediate context of Irish events, but also in the immediate context of the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 in America. And this was, of course, a response to the perception in the 1790s that French and Irish alien forces were at work within the heart of the nation. So during a congressional debate on naturalization, this phrase is written about a lot. It was made clear that what were called hordes of wild Irishmen with their incendiary political ideas were not welcome in America. And this, of course, means, the Irish with French Republican political beliefs. They came to epitomize the unwanted alien for the Federalists.
I understand that contemporary American critics tended to read Clitheroe as simply Irish, but you see him as very specifically Scots-Irish.
Yeah, I think it's important to be specific. So he's from Armagh in Ulster. He's implied not to stand out in any way in his Protestant enclave in Pennsylvania in terms of sort of denomination. He's the son of an Irish yeoman farmer, and he's the possessor of a British surname. His surname is Edney. And on fleeing Ireland, of course, he takes the predominant Ulster Scots immigrant route of the era of travelling from Belfast to Philadelphia. This origin, would explain, I think, the ease with which he is accepted in the Anglican ruling class Lorimer family of Dublin. Despite their difference in class, both Clitheroe and the Lorimers originate from the British colony in Ireland.
So, what are the implications of his very specific Irish background, as you've explained, when we think about the original American readership of this novel back in 1799? So
the Ulster cohort had, it might seem, I think, in America being flooded by 1798 political refugees, they seem maybe to have gone native in terms of political allegiance, right, to the Irish radical cause. So in the novel, these really unconvincing rationalizations are repeatedly offered by the narrator as to why Clitheroe entered Mrs. Lorimer's chambers with a dagger in his hand soon after killing her brother. But I think if we describe Clitheroe's actions in Ireland in bare bones term, the imputation is treachery to his own, given the settler origins he shares with the Lorimer siblings. Given what I've just said, for the conservative white, and Brown himself, the author, was very conservative. So for the conservative white Anglo-American reader of 1799, Clitheroe was a British Protestant settler who had first degenerated into savagery in Ireland and brings that dangerous disorder with him to America. So he did violence there, so he'll do violence here, I think, is the thinking.
Well, it's remarkable that political upheaval in contemporary late 18th century Ireland makes its way into an American novel.
Yeah, I think that too. Like Edgar Huntley is just this wonderful narrative in terms of suggesting an awareness of contemporary Irish politics in America, even if its Irish specifics seem no longer fully legible, maybe to American readers and critics today.
Well, despite the anxiety that's provoked by the events such as the 1798 uprising, the general trajectory of depiction of the Scots-Irish often followed the general trajectory of their assimilation to white Anglo-America. Can you describe where you see that, as it were, surfacing in American writing?
I guess Pennsylvania seems to be sort of ground zero for a lot of this, because it was the preeminent destination for 18th century Ulster immigrants. And by 1790, the increasingly influential Scots-Irish composed approximately 25% of Philadelphia's population. So the tradition of representing the Irish servant on the American stage, as a sort of a really bad stereotype in many ways. We think of that as a post 1845 famine tradition with the Bridget maid figure, right? Particularly, there's been a lot of attention to that, but it actually stretches back to a period in which to be Irish was probably to be of Ulster Presbyterian stock. And I'm thinking of a 1795 Philadelphia play called The Triumphs of Love by somebody called John Murdoch. So this play, staged in Philadelphia, it sort of presents the whitening or assimilation of an indentured servant named Patrick. And it does so by contrasting him with an enslaved character called Sambo. And Sambo is very grotesque and vain in the play. Patrick sort of talks back to his Quaker employer. He's considered kind of almost on a par with him in some ways. So the names Patrick and Sambo, they're really early usages of what were to become, of course, commonplace forms of derogatory address for Irish and African-American men, respectively. But as I said, Patrick's whiteness is beginning to kind of emerge, consolidate, especially through this sense of equality he almost has with his employer. And at the close of the play, Patrick is preparing to wed his American-born sweetheart, what's called native at the time. She's white, obviously, European. And of course, this implies that he's poised to assimilate.
That assimilation to broader white Anglo-American causes the Scots-Irish voice to become inaudible to some degree, according to some writers, correct?
Yeah, I think these tropes of kind of invisibility, silence, they've attached themselves to sort of narratives that try to recover Scots-Irishness as an identity that's kind of submerged, or even as an Irish diasporic literary tradition. Of course, Patrick Griffin, whom I think you've spoken to in this series, he's got this masterful study of the Scots-Irish in America, and the title is The People with No Name. And then again, in terms of for all the attention the Scots-Irish have had from scholars of literature, they may equally be termed the people with no literature. And I think, of course, that comes from the fact that they're neither and both Irish and British, right? And the writers who do not fit ready-made classifications of nationality or ethnicity, they tend to be forgotten or misrepresented. And I see this particularly in a wonderful passage in a novel by the Scots-Irish novelist Ellen Glasgow. She was a Pulitzer Prize winner. She's this great realist novel from 1925 called Barren Ground, where she really explicitly addresses this issue.
Well, tell us then a little bit about that novel and where you see this concern with Scots-Irish invisibility in the work.
Sure. So it's a narrative centered on a woman called Dorinda. She's from a modest Virginia, Scots-Irish Presbyterian background, and she's been deeply betrayed by her plantation stock lover. So he's higher class. So Dorinda loses her idealism, and she ruthlessly pursues wealth. And then the action is about her sort of gaining that. So there's a fascinating moment where the novel lays out how class and denomination in Dorinda's Virginia town, the differences between those of Ulster Presbyterian heritage and the more culturally dominant Anglo-Episcopalians, how this leads to the invisibility of, what are by now the Scots-Irish. I'm just going to read it here. It's the good families of the state of Virginia have preserved, among other things, custom, history, tradition, romantic fiction, and the Episcopal Church. The Scots-Irish, according to the records of clergymen, which are the only surviving records, have reserved nothing except themselves. Ignored alike by history and fiction, they have their inconspicuous place in the social strata midway between the lower gentility and the upper class of poor white. And I'll stop it there. So I think just as, if we look at Irish literature, the Ulster Scots voice is not particularly accounted for in the Irish canon most of the time. I think the Scots-Irish presence is a kind of a hidden double of the Irish American literary canon, a double that's, only occasionally glimpsed or even named.
Okay, so you see this effaced Irishness in the case of one of the most celebrated American writers, and who's generally understood to be unethnicized, right? I'm talking about Henry James. Come on, Henry James and Scots-Irish?
Yeah. Let's talk about Henry James and his identity. So after the 1845 famine, immigrant influx, the Scots-Irish melded into Anglo-America, or began to, in the American Northeast in particular. And that transition from ethnic to elite for some in that location, I think it marks the work of Henry James, who's a Scots-Irish writer who would never have labeled himself as Scots-Irish. He is, as you note, sort of routinely regarded as an unethnicized elite Anglo-American. But his identity is more interesting to me, than that. He was born into wealth in New York. And in his lifetime, belief in a superior Saxon, Germanic, that is white Northern European, belief in this kind of idea of it as a race dominated white Protestant America's fantasy of its superior origins and its own destiny.
Indeed, and that's why I'm curious to know how far back do Henry James's roots go, Irish roots?
So his Ulster Presbyterian grandfather, his name was William James, as was Henry's brother. So William James was born on a 25-acre farm in Baileyborough, County Cavan, in Ireland. And he emigrated in the 18th century. So prior to, of course, the famine, which kickstarted poor Western Seaboard Catholic flight to America, the majority of immigrants from Ireland were, Eastern Seaboard Protestant, as I'm sure has been discussed in sort of the podcasts here. So William James immigrated in 1789, to be precise. He made a fortune in Albany, upstate New York. And this was a period in which the Scots-Irish were beginning to shed their initial kind of not quite whiteness, which, was acquired due to this early frontier role as bulwark between native and settler, as reflected in sort of the novel we've discussed, Edgar Huntly.
So did the Jameses shed their Irish identity immediately?
No, there appears to have been, enough residual feeling for Ireland into the second generation that Henry's father actually visited the Cavan homestead in 1837. So I always say that he's the first Irish-American tourist. So, however, in the elite northeastern milieu of James's birth in the 1840s, it was assumed that the America that mattered socially and culturally was one of British descent. And so after the famine influx, and in order to differentiate themselves from this refugee class, really out of their motherland, those of James's Ulster Protestant ancestry increasingly identified with Protestant Anglo-America, in many cases, not all. But whether Anglo-America identified with the Scots-Irish is not always clear.
That's an interesting one. I know that you've written that Ralph Waldo Emerson's influential taxonomy of the Saxon racial roots of superior white America in his volume, English Traits, did not enfold the Scots-Irish, who were white and Protestant, but crucially were Irish.
Yeah. So in order to unpack that, I'll just start with the fact that, the new Irish, the Italians, Jewish immigrants, they were considered not quite white, right, in the 19th century US Northeast. And to some, by this time, descendants of the 18th century Scots-Irish were not quite Irish, right, at this stage, but they were also not quite Anglo-Saxon. So James was born in 1843, which is like right before the famine begins. And he grew up seeing the transformation of New York due to this influx of refugee Irish. I think it's important to remember that during his own lifetime, Irish America transformed from predominantly Protestant to predominantly Catholic. His family moved to West 14th Street in New York when he was a boy. And as the century progressed, that actual street evolved in New Yorkers' imagination as a kind of a boundary between the orderly and modern gridded streets above and the warren of the new immigrants' slums below. And he wryly describes this West 14th Street childhood home in an autobiography as a territory of pigs, poultry, and Irish pubs.
Right. Well, in one of his early novels, Washington Square, I think we start to see really that distancing from his Irishness pretty clearly then.
Yes, I think in that novel, it's 1818 novel, a genteel woman, she decides against a meeting in Manhattan's southern tip due to, and I'm going to quote it here, one's being exposed to intrusion from the Irish immigrants who at this point alight. So in his fiction, such as Daisy Miller, there's a kind of an anxiety regarding the contagion of low status. In that case, it's Italians, So there's a kind of a coded anxiety in his many, many writings about endangered status. And I think that anxiety around status is that non-Gaelic Protestant Irishness, which of course is originally the most common Irish ancestry in America. But this might become mistaken for what it was not, poor Catholic Gaelic and post-famine.
And doesn't it turn out that James did have some cause to be cautious or anxious?
Yeah. So his Boston Brahmin associate, Oliver Wendell Holmes, he described the Jameses as Irish and underbred. Ouch. While Emerson's son, getting back to the Emerson's family again, he suggested that the James family's loudness betrayed their Irish descent. And so this kind of there's an interesting moment more recently. There's an opening description of William James Sr., so his grandfather, in a 2013 Albany newspaper, and it describes the grandfather as, quote, a dirt poor Irish farm boy who sailed to the New World with a few coins in his pockets. Now that would have made the refined Henry James absolutely wince, but I think it does the service, that description, of suggesting how William James's modest but not impoverished Irish origins would have been sort of recast, sort of would have been changed. The perception of it would have been changed by the visibility of genuinely dirt poor Irish farm boys in America after the 1845 famine.
Right. Yeah. So does James ever address his own Irish origins in his fiction in any way?
Wow. Okay. So there's a character called Christopher Newman. He's a titled businessman character in James's 1877 novel called The American. And Newman has worked for a living since the age of 10, and he's made his large fortune. And I read that one as the closest portrait in James's fiction of his own Irish-born grandfather, William, who is, of course, another new man from upstate New York, whose own modest background spurred the creation of a massive fortune. So in the novel, there's a really interesting moment where there's a kind of a strange eruption. So Newman, the character, has become rich by his 30s, and now he's traveling to find a wife to elevate him socially, right? He's a little unpolished. So he's asked by somebody else, an acquaintance, if he would object to a foreign bride. And a friend kind of jokingly interjects, oh, no Irish need apply. I think it's really striking that this anti-Irish immigrant prejudice erupts in a novel whose central character seems to be inspired by the James family's own self-made Irish immigrant progenitor. I think in general in James's writing, he tried not to openly name his Irish immigrant ancestry, but he did seem to dwell on it in his writings nonetheless, in a kind of coded way.
Let's move us into the 20th century, Mary. There's a couple of very major writers I know that I want to hear you talk about, and those are Scott Fitzgerald and Margaret Mitchell. But in coming to those, as with everything you're doing, you're coming somewhat sideways. You're giving us perspectives perhaps we haven't heard before. So when we think about Mitchell, of course, who's the author with Gone with the Wind, one of the things I find fascinating is that you give us a fresh way to think about that famous novel by telling us about another writer. That is Frank Yerby, who's of Irish descent, but is not white, correct?
Correct. Yes. After centuries of Irish presence in multiracial America, not every Irish American writer is going to be white, right? That's not been recognized, but of course it turns out to be true. I want to talk about Yerby and his response to what might be one of the most controversial books in the Irish American literary canon, which is, of course, what you just mentioned, Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. That response was Yerby's 1946 novel called The Foxes of Harrow. It's a Southern historical romance. It centers on an Irish planter in the slaveholding South. His name is Stephen Fox, hence Foxes of Harrow. Yerby had some Irish ancestry on his mother's side and was really interested in what to do with that, right? So I suggest that Foxes of Harrow responds to Margaret Mitchell's best-selling novel of Gone with the Wind from 10 years previously. It's a 1936 bestseller. There's some really interesting similarities between the two. They were both raised in Georgia during segregation. They both had mothers of Irish descent, but of course their socially assigned racial identities created very, very divergent approaches to representing the South in their historical novels. Gone with the Wind, of course, remains controversial for opening with, a vision of an antebellum world of grace and for a plotline that justifies the KKK as needed protection for Southern women in the post-Civil War South. There was the Foxes of Harrow was his breakout, a bestseller. And it kick-started a historical novel writing career that made Yerby America's highest earning novelist during the 1950s. This man was very, very wealthy.
Whoa.
As with Gone with the Wind, Yerby's novel covers the rise and fall of white Southern fortunes, but it departs from Mitchell in really sort of focusing on African American characters, giving them a lot of depth and dimension, and in its positive depiction of Reconstruction. That is the post-Civil War period, which is not a positive moment in Mitchell's novel. But where they sort of meet is that they both feature penniless, off-white Irish planters of modest birth. And both of these planters, they transform themselves into the white exploitative landowner class to whom they themselves had once been subject in Ireland, right? So Gerald O'Hara in Gone with the Wind and Stephen Fox and the Foxes of Harrow are their names, obviously. And only Yerby's Irish planter, Stephen Fox, ultimately understands the connections between his Irish and American contexts, however.
Can you just remind us briefly, we're talking about lengthy novels here, of the plot line of 1936's Gone with the Wind and how it is echoed in Yerby's novel a decade later?
Yeah, so obviously the two planters, but I'll just get into the specifics of it. So in Gone with the Wind, as a young man in Ireland, Gerald O'Hara murders an oppressive landlord's agent, and he subsequently flees. O'Hara's family had been disowned of their estate generations previously. That's an important detail. So arriving in the South in the 1820s, O'Hara acquires his first enslaved man and a neglected plantation in Georgia in games of poker, and whitens himself by marrying into the local elite. These plot points almost all repeat in Yerby's novel, but Yerby's novel is what one critic has called a prequel to Gone with the Wind, because its action focuses on the Gerald O'Hara figure, Stephen Fox. So Mitchell, of course, as you've seen the movie, you'll remember she moves from an opening emphasis on Gerald to centre all the action on Scarlett, his daughter. So in Mitchell's novel, although the Catholic Irish nationalist O'Hara flees an Ireland that has stripped his Catholic family of their estate, he is very happy to subsequently seize land for his slave plantation in a Georgia region that had been brutally cleared of Indigenous presence.
So this echoes the history of Mitchell's own Irish ancestors, right?
Yes, I think this is something that isn't talked about enough, that Margaret Mitchell's own Tipperary Catholic gentry antecedents, these were on her mother's side, they had in fact acquired the Georgia land for their own slave plantation in this very manner, in this very location. And so that Georgia plantation house remained in her family into her lifetime, and she visited it quite often.
Tell us just a little more about how Yerby's novel then differs in emphasis from Mitchell's.
Yerby's awareness of his dual African and Irish heritages, I think this is readable in his hero, Stephen Fox. Stephen Fox has what the novel calls gutter snipe origins. He was a Dublin street urchin, which means he's kind of off-white. And I think that kind of off-whiteness of his origins, it challenges this black-white binary, right? That's so certain in Mitchell's novel, right? Also, the novel contains many mixed race characters, many racially ambiguous characters, even Europeans. The French characters are described as having swarthy skin and so on in the novel. So, he's a very accessible writer, as was Mitchell, but I think he debunks this Southern white fairy tale, right, of the graceful plantation life. There's one amazing scene which actually foresees a Toni Morrison scene as well. The scene in The Foxes of Harrow, in which an enslaved woman attempts to take her newborn with her when she commits suicide, rather than have the child, grow up unfree. And of course, this is exposing the stark reality of the desperation created by enslavement, which is quite a maneuver to make in a popular mass market plantation novel.
Yeah, it's also to say that Gone with the Wind evades those very realities, right?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, by contrast with Yerby, Mitchell propounds what's been called the cherished darky myth, right? She has Scarlett, Gerald O'Hara's daughter, referred to a house slave, so to speak, Peter. She calls him family, right? But this claim does not suggest interracial ties of the sort depicted by Yerby. At the end of the action in Yerby, some of the formerly enslaved are indeed family of the Irish planter. That would be impossible in the universe Mitchell creates. So Yerby had a predominantly white mainstream readership, and his marketing the South was very careful to evade the issue of his racial identity. And so, he deviates from Mitchell in placing these rebellious, articulate, and prominent African-American characters at the center of his action. And these characters kind of take over the action, and Stephen Fox kind of recedes towards the end of the action.
So it looks or sounds like from what you're saying that the Irish origins here and Irish reference points play out differently in each of these novels. Mitchell's Planter, Gone with the Wind, doesn't see any connection between sectarian oppression in Ireland that's been fled and the South slave system. But on the other hand, in Yerby's novel, those street origins that you mentioned of Fox, they seem to be an implicit source of his view of life throughout the novel.
Yeah, his view of life is very ambivalent. And I think Yerby puts words in his planter's mouth of the sort that I have never seen uttered before by the so-called master in a Southern plantation romance. And I'm just going to read them. Slavery is a very convenient and pleasant system for us. I have my leisure, which I haven't earned, and my wealth, which I didn't work for. End quote. So Mitchell's Gerald, I think, justifies his acquisition of plantation and the enslaved as, quote, this is his justification, the hunger of an Irishman who has been a tenant on the lands his people once had owned, which is an extraordinary justification. So Stephen flees Ireland to gain what he calls freedom, right? He says this kind of in a way where he's not really examining that word, but by the end of the action, by his final words, as his plantation is threatened by war and as the hunger of his Dublin street days returns, I think that his final words suggest a reluctant understanding of the costs paid by others for his freedom. And that, of course, is entirely absent in Gone with the Wind. And Stephen's final words are, for a little while, we lived like gods. I'm not sure that it was good for us.
Okay, so Yerby, Mitchell, both popular writers, best-selling authors. Let's move on to the more literary authors in about this same period. And I'm thinking here particularly of Scott Fitzgerald, also Eugene O'Neill. These are two writers that you see as dealing with the legacy of their Irish ancestry in very different ways.
Yeah, so they were Eugene O'Neill, F. Scott Fitzgerald. They were near contemporaries. I'll start briefly with Fitzgerald. So during his 1920s heyday, the post-famine Irish, they were assimilating, but they also remained at times vulnerable to Ku Klux Klan race rhetoric. And of course, the decades anti-immigration legislation. The Klan, of course, opposed both off-white Catholic immigration from various parts of Europe. And they opposed Al Smith, who was the first Irish Catholic nominee of a major party when he ran as Democratic candidate for US president in 1928. So, this was the era of Fitzgerald's success. We sort of need to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. The 1920s, New York, that's Fitzgerald, at least what we think of. So where do you read this impact in The Great Gatsby, 1925?
Yeah, so we have to talk about The Great Gatsby, right? So I think the grappling with status of this title character, or Gatsby, I think it reflects the author's own ambivalence regarding his own Irish ancestry. He was, of course, keenly aware of the contested nature of Catholic Irish whiteness into his lifetime. There's an extraordinary line in one of his letters, a letter from 1933. He described himself as, quote, half black Irish in a letter to another Irish writer, John O'Hara. And I think this phrase, O'Hara uses a similar phrase of himself in their correspondence. This phrase, half black Irish, I think it signals for him his cohort's ambiguous placement within America's complex, within its sort of network, its structure of race, ethnicity, sectarianism, class. So in his life, in his work, he toggled between a kind of a common Irish-American aspiration, right, to present as uncontestably white. And then he also sort of sometimes maneuvered to sort of querying, like really questioning the costs of passing as Anglo-Saxon for the Teutonic. So he has another interesting moment in a letter. His letters are very telling. A 1917 letter, when he was quite young, he describes himself as being Teutonic, Saxon, right, on the outside, but Celt within. So he was fair-haired, right? But that's such an interesting phrase because it suggests racial passing. And sort of these kind of code words like Teutonic and so on, these are code words, of course, so uncontestable whiteness, right? These are all over his writing.
I find that really interesting because I can remember from reading not just the novel, but criticism and commentary on the novel over the years that there's been a lot of speculation that Gatsby is passing as a Jewish man or a black man. But you're suggesting something slightly different here.
I think all of those things are operating as a way, they're all ultimately rooted in Fitzgerald's own
Mm.
anxiety regarding his own ethnicity. So all over his work, it's always about ethnic and racial others, right?
Okay.
People on the spectrum, right? And I think ultimately it's coming from what we see in the letters, where he's much more open about that anxiety.
All right. So, what about moving to O'Neill then? What are the overlaps? How does O'Neill channel his Irishness?
So yeah, O'Neill, so American playwright, of course, Nobel laureate, born in New York, 1888. Very interestingly, he was born to an Irish famine refugee and a stage actor called James O'Neill. His mother was more kind of lace curtain, aspirational Irish. So like Fitzgerald, a decade later, he aspired to the Ivy League. And like Fitzgerald, he found himself a bad fit there. He lasted only a year at Princeton. Fitzgerald also dropped out of the Ivy League. Like Fitzgerald also, he intermittently struggled with depression and alcoholism. But that's where they stopped converging, though, as there was a really strong pushback in O'Neill's work to this desire to leave Irish off-whiteness behind that we see as a kind of a struggle in Fitzgerald's work and life.
Now that's interesting. So, as you have already said, Fitzgerald's reaction to this is to continually explore status anxiety in his writings. But O'Neill, by stark contrast, tends to go more in the direction of expressing solidarity with the marginalized, correct?
Right. So his plays were among the first to include speeches in American English vernacular and to depict, social outsiders. I think really particularly interesting is the fact that he insisted that only a black actor could take on the role of the title African-American character in his play, The Emperor Jones. This was a 1920 play. So this gave the first opportunity to a black actor to play a major role on a Broadway stage. And this was, of course, very audacious. We're talking about a theatrical universe in which Othello was regularly portrayed by white actors in blackface, and among whom were James O'Neill, as it happened. His own father played Othello in blackface.
That's quite something. O'Neill's play All God's Children Got Wings, 1924, it features a black protagonist, and it's also the first drama that features an interracial couple on the Broadway stage. That's quite something for the period. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So All God's Children Got Wings portrays working class and white Ella, and she marries an ambitious African-American man named Jim. It's important to remember that interracial marriage was still illegal in the majority of American states in 1924. And when word got out, before it opened in Manhattan, that the white Ella would kiss Jim's hand during the action, there was a national uproar and was a threat to O'Neill's own family from the Ku Klux Klan.
Ella is usually read as white, I think, but you're very clear that it's more important to read her as Irish, correct?
Right. So she's not explicitly named as Irish, but her surname is Downey, which is an Irish name, and her speech patterns infer actually a Dublin accent, interestingly enough. So since the play is often discussed as simply a depiction of black-white tensions, I think it's important to stress that Ella is Irish-American. Also, I think she was played in the opening run by an actor called Mary Blair, who was the daughter of Belfast immigrants. And I might also note that Jim was played by Paul Robeson, in a role that launched his stellar career.
Can you tell us just a little bit about the plot of All God's Children Got Wings?
Yeah, so it's set in a mixed race neighborhood, and it opens with Jim and Ella as child playmates, so very happily playing together. As a child, Ella appears to possess no negative racial stereotypes, but this older Ella that we see in most of the action, who marries the ambitious Jim, she only does so as a route out of a downward spiral. And by this time, she appears to have learned racism.
So how does this plot line reflect on the broader trajectory of Irish and African relations?
So O'Neill, he was very deeply read in Irish and American history, and the tragedy, I think, of Ella's racism towards her own husband, I think it enacts on a micro scale what O'Neill's work as a whole. It's very interesting when you see his whole body of work. It critiques Irish America's failure across centuries to create solidarity with their fellow oppressed. Ella is Irish American, and that's not the same thing in 1924 as being an unethnicized white woman, right? That's the very year in which the federal Johnson-Reed Act effectively banned off-white immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. So Ella too would possibly have been something of a racialized outsider in 1920s America, but she whitens herself, right, by treating her own husband as a racial other.
So I'm just wondering about these writings, which are, so, I think, fascinating in how they take on matters of race and ethnic relations in the periods that you're talking about. But I wonder how they might speak to us today. What about Yerby's 1946 Southern Plantation novel, for example? How does that speak to us today?
So Yerby, of course, had this double vision granted by his African and Irish heritages that I think is really valuable. The Foxes of Harrow was a best-selling novel. It's gone into multiple imprints. So old copies are available. I've taught it. We found copies. So I want people to maybe seek it out. It's a rollicking good read, but it's also very provocative about the complex role played by the Irish as both victims and perpetrators of oppression across centuries of history in Ireland and in America.
I'm curious what your experience then is teaching a novel like this today.
So, I've lived and taught in America for a while now, and I think I find a writer like Yerby particularly useful, how he sort of negotiated sort of that complexity. So when I began teaching 18th century Ulster Scots dialect poets alongside the Irish speaking 18th century contemporaries in my Irish literature classes at the University of Connecticut, students who identified as Scots-Irish were often surprised to have their ancestry and its relationship to Ireland described and explained. They'd often had a certain amount of confusion about it. So I started to become aware that Irishness in America was much more complex than the familiar kind of white Catholic immigrant made good story, right, that we like to celebrate. And again, when I taught contemporary Irish writers of colour, my African-American students sometimes referred to their own Irish-American ancestry during discussions, but it was often in a tentative tone, right, that suggested that it was not a heritage that they had ever been invited to identify with. So my awareness of, as was the varieties of Irish American identity, was bolstered by my students' recognition of their Irish links, right? However qualified and hesitant and however problematic that Irish or American history from which, the connection emerged, however problematic it was, they were still, I think, hoping to grapple with it. So as I taught these, Black, white, Scots-Irish, Irish-American writers from Yerby to Margaret Mitchell to Henry James, I've come to realize that the Irish in America are and always have been incredibly diverse, right? In terms of, denomination, obviously, but political outlook, allegiance, racial and ethnic ethnicity. I think it's important to keep this to the forefront in contemporary Ireland that's currently experiencing political clashes over the assimilation of immigrants. And I think in an America in which that issue never goes away.
In conclusion, how does that complexity shape what you think of as the Irish American literary canon?
Oh, wow. So I suppose, scholars of this category, right, this Irish American literature category, they've customarily excluded canonical writers of Ulster Presbyterian origin, such as Henry James and Ellen Glasgow, as well as other such writers that I didn't get a chance to describe or to discuss, such as Edgar Allan Poe, John Steinbeck, who are both Scots-Irish. So given that kind of effacement, an American writer of colour of Irish ancestry, such as Yerby, remains particularly, I think, invisible within the Irish American canon on multiple levels. We need to start thinking of Irish American writing and writers as being just as diverse as Ireland and America. And I suppose we need to remember that sort of diversity is not a new phenomenon either. When we remember, like what we talked about right at the beginning, which was, these 18th century depictions of the Scots-Irish on the American page and on the American stage.
Mary, thank you for your time. And thank you for such a fresh look at what we think is the Irish American literary canon.
Thank you, Liam. It's been a pleasure.
That's all for this episode of Ireland and the Making of America. Thanks to Mary Burke for joining and sharing her insights on the Irish American literary experience. You can follow the series on all your favourite podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and you can follow us on social media and at the Clinton Institute. And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, share, leave a review. We'll be back next week with another conversation on Ireland and the making of America. This podcast was brought to you by the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin and produced with thanks by Michelle May.